Darkness swallows the fields of Normandy. Rain lashes through shattered orchards, turning mud into a thick, sucking trap. Smoke from destroyed villages curls into the sky. Somewhere in the distance, artillery booms, echoing like the drums of death. Inside a German bunker, an officer slams a folder onto the table. The men lean in, expecting maps or orders. What they see instead stops them cold, a single maple leaf patch. He leans forward. His voice is sharp, almost trembling. If you see this, you do not hesitate. You do not flinch. You do not survive if you fail. The men exchange uneasy glances. Why fear an army so small? The Americans have numbers. The British have experience. But the Canadians? The Canadians fight differently. Reports from Sicily, Ortona, and the flooded dikes of the Scheldt tell the story. Relentless, ruthless, unpredictable. One German soldier would later confess, "They move like ghosts at night, strike like lightning, and never stop. They do not retreat. They do not beg for mercy. They kill because they want to." Another officer wrote in horror, "The Americans kill with equipment. The British kill with patience. The Canadians kill with intent. And there is no escaping them." The officer closes the folder, his face pale. "We can handle the Americans. We can stall the British. But when the maple leaf appears, pray you are not in their path." This was not rumor. This was fact. The German army, the conquerors of Europe, feared these soldiers more than any other Allied force. Tonight, we will uncover why the Canadians became the nightmare that haunted the Wehrmacht, to understand why the German army feared the Canadian infantry above all others. We must step away from the battlefield and examine the men behind the rifles. Canada of 1939 to 1945 was not the polite, peaceful nation the world imagines today. It was a young country forging its identity in fire and blood, sending volunteers across the Atlantic to fight a war that would test them to the limit, unlike the Americans, who relied on industrial might and overwhelming numbers, or the British, seasoned but war-weary. Canada fielded a small, highly trained force. 5 infantry divisions, 2 armoured brigades, few in number but lethal beyond measure. What they lacked in size they made up for in intensity, discipline, and the will to win. Much of this stemmed from training. Canadian soldiers spent years in Britain before seeing combat, drilling endlessly, mastering marksmanship, learning small unit tactics, and practicing night operations. They were taught to think independently, to seize opportunities, to act with aggression when hesitation could mean death. German intelligence noted early on, Canadian platoons do not wait for orders. They advance, adapt, and attack with calculated ferocity. But it wasn't just training. Many of these men were hardened by life itself. Farmers, trappers, loggers, fishermen, used to extreme conditions and physical endurance. They had faced hardship before ever seeing a battlefield. By the time they met German soldiers in Sicily or Italy, the average Canadian infantryman was a coiled spring of focus, aggression, and determination. Their early engagements shocked the Germans. In Sicily, at Pacino and Agira, Canadian troops advanced where others hesitated. They adapted to urban and rugged terrain, clearing buildings room by room, striking at night and refusing to yield. Reports from German paratroopers expressed disbelief. They fight with a precision and aggression we did not expect from colonial troops. By the time they reached Ortona, Normandy, and the Scheldt, this reputation had solidified. The Germans didn't just see soldiers, they saw relentless predators, capable of turning impossible terrain into a killing ground. Unlike American units, which often relied on artillery and airstrikes to overcome defenses, or British units, which advanced cautiously, the Canadians combined discipline, aggression, and initiative in a terrifying formula. This combination of rigorous training, lived experience, and unyielding aggression would become the defining hallmark of Canadian infantry. It created a force that the Wehrmacht could not predict, could not outmaneuver, and above all, could not ignore. And in the fields, towns, and rivers of Europe, that fear would soon be written in blood. The hedgerows of Normandy were meant to be a German's greatest ally. Thick, high, and nearly impenetrable, they turned open fields into labyrinths where tanks struggled, artillery was limited, and defenders could kill with impunity. But the Canadians did not see obstacles. They saw challenges to overcome. On June 7, 1944, Canadian troops moved into their sectors. Every step was deliberate, every pause calculated. Unlike the Americans, who relied on artillery barrages to soften enemy positions, and the British, who advanced cautiously and waited for reinforcements, the Canadians closed the distance with terrifying efficiency. Scouts probed ahead, marking sniper positions. Machine guns swept fire across the fields, not to destroy but to pin the enemy while infantry flanked. German units quickly noticed a disturbing pattern. Canadians did not pause after initial contact. If a squad lost men, they regrouped immediately and advanced again. If a machine gun nest cut them down, the attackers would maneuver around it, approach from unexpected angles, and storm it with grenades and bayonets. There was no hesitation, no retreat, and no predictable rhythm. In La Menil Patrie, the Queen's own rifles advanced through hedgerows under heavy fire. A German report later noted, "They move faster than expected, striking like a hammer, relentless. When they lose men, they do not falter. They strike again immediately." Another officer wrote, "It is not just courage, it is a stubborn, calculated ferocity that cannot be broken by bullets, mud, or machine guns." Night operations magnified this fear. Most Allied armies avoided combat after dark, fearing confusion and friendly fire. Canadians thrived in it. They struck silently, moving like shadows, exploiting darkness to flank and surprise. German soldiers would later admit that nightfall offered no safety against Canadian attacks. They could never rest, never relax. The Scheldt estuary in late 1944 illustrated this ruthlessness. The flooded, muddy terrain was considered impassable. Tanks bogged down, British units delayed. But Canadian infantry crossed waist-deep water under fire, pressed forward across open dikes, and struck German fortifications with both determination and ingenuity. Survivors described seeing the attackers advance steadily through freezing water, seemingly impervious to bullets and artillery. It was in these brutal environments, the hedgerows of Normandy, the flooded Scheldt, and later in the streets of Ortona, that Canadian infantry cemented a reputation that terrified German officers. They were unpredictable, aggressive, disciplined, and relentless. Not because they had more men or better weapons, but because they fought with a combination of skill, courage, and calculated ruthlessness that no German soldier had faced before. The maple leaf was no longer a patch. It had become a symbol of fear. December 1943. Ortona, Italy. A medieval town of narrow streets and stone buildings, each wall scarred by artillery fire. The German paratroopers defending it considered it impregnable. Every doorway, every window, every alley was a killing zone. The British had stalled. The Americans were focused elsewhere. Now it was the Canadians' turn. The first wave approached under the cover of darkness, boots crunching over debris. Officers had learned that street-to-street fighting was suicidal. Step wrong, and a sniper or machine gun crew would end your life in an instant. Step right, and mines or hidden defenders awaited. But the Canadians had a solution no German had anticipated: mouse-holing. Instead of advancing along streets, they blew holes through walls, moving from house to house. Grenades flew ahead to clear rooms. Submachine guns rattled. Bayonets flashed. Canadian soldiers slid through shattered floors, climbed rubble-strewn attics, and emerged in buildings the Germans thought secure. Each movement was precise, practiced, and terrifyingly fast. The German defenders were stunned. Every time they thought they had the Canadians cornered, they appeared somewhere else, behind them, flanking them, cutting off their escape. The paratroopers shouted orders, but confusion spread like wildfire. The Canadians were not just attacking, they were dominating, adapting, improvising, and executing with lethal efficiency. In one room, a German officer would later recall, "We expected an assault, what came was like ghosts." They fought with a ferocity that seemed beyond human. There was no pause, no mercy, only death. The battle became so savage that journalists nicknamed it Little Stalingrad. House to house, room to room, the Canadians pressed forward, leaving the Germans reeling. By the end of Ortona, the town had fallen. Casualties were heavy, but the objective was secured. More importantly, the myth of Canadian ferocity was now undeniable. Elite German units, the paratroopers and SS soldiers ignored that no other Allied infantry combined tactical skill with raw aggression in the same way. For the Germans, the lesson was terrifyingly simple. Canadians were different, unpredictable, relentless, fearsome. They fought not for strategy alone, not for maps or orders, but for the kill, for the inch of ground in front of them. And wherever the maple leaf patch appeared, fear followed. Ortona was the crucible that defined them. And from here, the Canadian infantry's reputation as the Wehrmacht's nightmare would spread across Europe, one brutal yard at a time. Ortona had tested the Canadians' courage and skill, but Normandy awaited, a far larger stage where their reputation would be cemented. The D-Day landings were not just a test of strength, they were a test of nerve. While the Americans faced Omaha and the British targeted Sword, the Canadians landed on Juno Beach, a stretch fortified with bunkers, sea walls, and deadly obstacles designed to shred men before they even reached the shore. From the first moments, the Germans noticed something different. The Canadians advanced under fire with an intensity that stunned seasoned defenders. Where others might hesitate, they pushed forward through waist-deep water, across mined beaches, and into machine gun fire with unwavering determination. Casualties were high, yet they did not falter. Every fallen comrade was replaced by another soldier pressing forward. It was not brute force alone. Canadian commanders had learned from Ortona and Sicily. They applied new tactics, suppressive fire from small teams, flanking maneuvers through gaps in obstacles, and relentless night raids to destabilize the enemy. Their approach was precise, disciplined, and terrifyingly effective. German field reports noted the psychological impact. Soldiers who had faced Americans and British before admitted a new, primal fear. One report bluntly stated, "The Americans kill with machines, the British with discipline, the Canadians kill with intent, and they do not stop." The defenders realized that facing Canadians meant exhaustion, constant pressure, and relentless aggression. Even in the hedgerows beyond the beaches, the Canadians showcased an uncanny adaptability. The terrain was meant to slow them, but they turned it into an advantage. Scouts advanced quietly, identifying enemy positions. Squads moved fluidly, attacking with combined arms, coordinating artillery with infantry advances, and exploiting every weakness in the German lines. Where others would dig in, the Canadians pushed forward, often striking at night when the enemy least expected it. This combination of aggression, precision, and adaptability created an almost mythical reputation. German soldiers whispered warnings, and high command memos began classifying Canadian infantry as the most dangerous Allied force. Their unpredictability, their willingness to fight in impossible conditions, and their refusal to retreat made them unlike any other enemy the Wehrmacht had faced. By the time the Canadians moved inland, they had become more than soldiers. They were a psychological weapon. Fear followed them like a shadow, and wherever the maple leaf appeared, German units braced for the inevitable carnage. Normandy would not just be a landing, it would be the stage where the world learned why Canadians were feared above all others. The Canadian landing at Juno Beach and subsequent push inland left a lasting mark, not just on the maps of Europe, but on the minds of German soldiers. Unlike the Americans who relied on overwhelming firepower, or the British who advanced cautiously, the Canadians demonstrated a lethal combination of skill, aggression, and adaptability that the enemy could neither predict nor counter. The psychological impact was immediate. German soldiers who had faced the horrors of the Eastern Front and North Africa found themselves unnerved by the Canadians' relentless advance. Intelligence reports from captured documents repeatedly described the same traits. They fight without pause, without mercy. They do not rest. They do not retreat. Even elite units such as paratroopers and SS divisions acknowledged that facing Canadian infantry was like facing a force beyond conventional rules of warfare. This reputation was not built solely on brute aggression. The Canadians mastered combined arms warfare, infantry, artillery, and armor working in seamless coordination. Their artillery, precise and devastating, would soften enemy positions just enough for infantry to close in. In urban environments, they innovated tactics like mouse-holing, moving house to house while minimizing exposure. In flooded or muddy terrain, they advanced where other Allied forces stalled, turning near-impossible landscapes into avenues of attack. The consequence was clear. German forces began to treat Canadian sectors with heightened caution. Units often tried to surrender to Americans or British if the Canadians were nearby. Orders from high command repeatedly stressed the danger of facing the maple leaf, and officers warned replacements that Canadian soldiers were not just skilled, they were relentless and personal in their attacks. This fear translated into results. Canadian troops captured vital positions, opened ports, and broke German defensive lines, often under conditions that would have stalled other Allied units. At the Scheldt estuary in Ortona and in the hedgerows of Normandy, their actions not only secured strategic objectives, but also shattered German morale. By the end of these operations, it was clear that the Canadians had created a new paradigm of infantry warfare. They combined the technical skill of seasoned soldiers with the aggression of elite shock troops, creating a force feared not for its size, but for its effectiveness. The Canadians' victories were hard-won and bloody, but each battle reinforced the psychological dominance they held over their enemy. For the Germans, the lesson was undeniable. In the Canadian infantry, they faced a foe who did not follow conventional rules, a foe who attacked relentlessly, and a foe whose presence alone could alter the outcome of a battle. Their fear was not a myth. It was forged in mud, blood, and fire, a fear that would echo throughout the Western Front and remain in history as a testament to Canadian courage and tenacity. By late 1944, the Canadians had earned a fearsome reputation, but the true test of their tenacity came at the Scheldt estuary, one of the most brutal battlefields of the Western Front. The Allies desperately needed the port of Antwerp to supply their armies, but the approaches were dominated by German fortifications and flooded, treacherous terrain. The Scheldt was a swamp of death, a nightmare of mud, freezing water, and open dikes, designed to stop any infantry advance. Other Allied forces had stalled. The British armoured divisions could not operate in the mud, and American units were focused on other fronts. Once again, the task fell to the Canadians. The 1st Canadian Army prepared to advance, knowing full well the cost would be high. German commanders believed the terrain itself was an unbeatable weapon, but the Canadians saw it differently. They attacked relentlessly, pushing through waist-deep water under constant fire. Mines, machine guns, artillery. Nothing could stop them. Their movements were coordinated, precise, and terrifyingly effective. Small units scouted ahead, identifying weak points, while others provided suppressive fire. Every advance was calculated, yet executed with the aggression and momentum that had become their hallmark. German soldiers watched in disbelief. Reports describe a horror unlike any before. They moved steadily through freezing water, ignoring bullets, mortars, and mines. It is as if the ground itself belongs to them. The Canadians did not just fight, they dominated. Every inch of terrain gained was paid for in blood, but the Germans realized that no amount of preparation could stop them. The psychological impact was devastating. German morale broke under the relentless pressure. Units that might have resisted crumbled when faced with the Canadians' determination. Even elite divisions began to fear surrendering directly to them, preferring to fall back or attempt negotiation with neighbouring British or American sectors. By the time the Scheldt was secured, the Canadians had not only achieved a critical strategic victory, but had also confirmed the terrifying reputation that German intelligence had begun to whisper months earlier. They were relentless, adaptive, and utterly unyielding. The maple leaf was now a symbol not just of Canada, but of fear itself. This battle solidified a truth recognized by all. Where the Americans relied on equipment and the British on strategy, the Canadians relied on courage, ingenuity, and sheer willpower. They were not just soldiers, they were a force the Germans dreaded to face, a hammer striking wherever resistance seemed impossible to overcome. After the horrors of the Scheldt estuary, the Canadians moved forward, carrying their fearsome reputation into the heart of Normandy's hedgerows. Here the fighting was personal, brutal, and unrelenting. The German defenders, seasoned soldiers and fanatical SS troops, faced an enemy who refused to conform to conventional warfare. Every hedge, every ditch, every ruined farm became a testing ground for Canadian innovation and aggression. The Canadians attacked with precision and faro. City. Small squads infiltrated German lines under cover of darkness, often striking before their targets realized they were under attack. The Germans had learned to anticipate artillery barrages, to brace for frontal assaults, but the Canadians were unpredictable. They combined stealth, firepower, and tactical ingenuity in ways that left defenders reeling in these close quarters battles. Canadian soldiers excelled. They stormed buildings, cleared trenches, and moved through flooded terrain without hesitation. Night raids became routine. German officers noted in captured reports, the Canadians fight like men possessed. They do not pause, they do not retreat. They strike at night, in rain, in mud. There is no safe place. The psychological impact was profound. German soldiers described facing Canadian units as facing a force beyond comprehension, a foe that attacked with both skill and an almost primal intensity. Unlike the Americans, whose firepower could be overwhelming but impersonal, or the British, who fought methodically and cautiously, the Canadians fought with intent. They killed with precision, they advanced with determination, and they carried a hatred forged on previous battlefields that made them unstoppable. This combination of aggression, tactical skill, and relentless momentum created fear at every level of the German command. Even elite SS units, veterans of the Eastern Front, admitted the Canadians were unlike any other Allied force. Memos and intelligence reports repeatedly stressed that where other armies could be predicted, Canadians were a force of chaos, organized, disciplined, and deadly. The battles in the hedgerows of Normandy, combined with previous engagements in Ortona and the Scheldt, established a clear hierarchy in the minds of German soldiers. Americans inspired respect for their equipment, the British for their discipline, but Canadians for their sheer lethal intent. Wherever they appeared, they altered the battlefield, forcing the enemy to fight differently and often unsuccessfully. By the time the Allies had secured Normandy, the Germans had learned a lesson they could not forget. The Canadians were more than soldiers. They were a psychological weapon, a force of fear, and a symbol of unstoppable aggression that changed the nature of every confrontation. By the end of the Normandy campaign, the Canadian infantry had proven their fearsome reputation beyond any doubt. The Germans, who had faced the Americans and British, now recognized the Canadians as a class apart. It was not their numbers, nor their equipment, but their relentless aggression, discipline, and psychological intensity that struck terror into enemy hearts. Captured German reports repeatedly emphasized a chilling truth: the Canadians were unpredictable. Where the Americans relied on overwhelming firepower, and the British on methodical strategy, the Canadians combined both with something else entirely: ferocity with purpose. German soldiers recounted the nightmare of fighting in hedgerows, flooded estuaries, and bombed-out towns, where Canadians advanced through mud, rain, and darkness, as if the environment itself belonged to them. Their victories carried consequences beyond the battlefield. German morale shattered when confronted with the relentless Maple Leaf units. Even elite SS divisions, veterans of the harsh Eastern Front, admitted that the Canadians fought in a way they had never encountered. Soldiers preferred surrendering to Americans or British troops rather than face the Canadians, a testament to the psychological terror they inspired. Strategically, this meant that Canadian units were often tasked with the most dangerous operations: the breaches, the assaults on heavily fortified positions, and the clearing of impossible terrain. Ortona, the Scheldt, and Normandy were just the beginning. Every operation tested not only skill but courage, and the Canadians delivered repeatedly. Their effectiveness reshaped the Allied approach to battle, proving that small, highly trained and motivated units could achieve objectives that larger armies struggled with. But the human cost was immense. Casualties were high, and each victory carried a bitter price. Yet it was precisely this willingness to endure loss, to press forward regardless of pain and danger, that magnified their reputation. The Germans understood that facing Canadian infantry was not just a military challenge, it was a psychological ordeal. In the aftermath, the Canadian Army emerged not just as an effective fighting force, but as a symbol of national identity forged in fire. They had earned the respect and fear of friend and foe alike, proving that determination, training, and unyielding courage could rival the largest armies in the world. The Germans had feared them for good reason. In every mud-soaked estuary, in every shattered town, in every hedgerow under fire, the Canadians had demonstrated a terrifying combination of skill, aggression, and relentless will. They were not just soldiers, they were the nightmare of the Western Front, a force that could neither be predicted nor contained. As the war drew to a close, the legacy of the Canadian infantry was undeniable. Across Europe, from the streets of Ortona to the flooded fields of the Scheldt and the hedgerows of Normandy, their ferocity had left an indelible mark on both allies and enemies. German soldiers remembered them not just as opponents, but as a force that inspired fear unmatched by any other Allied unit. The high casualty rates reflected the price they paid for this fearsome reputation. Every inch gained was paid in blood, yet the Canadians never wavered. Their achievements reshaped the Allied strategy, proving that determination, skill, and tactical innovation could overcome overwhelming odds. They were the army called upon to do what others could not, the shock troops who turned impossible missions into victories. Beyond the battlefield, Canada emerged as a nation forged in fire. The world recognized a country that had proven its mettle not through numbers or industrial might, but through courage, skill, and relentless resolve. The maple leaf was no longer just a symbol of Canada. It was a mark of fear, respect, and unyielding strength. For the German soldier in 1945, facing Canadians was a nightmare etched into memory. For history, it became a story of extraordinary bravery, unmatched ferocity, and a unique chapter of World War II. The Canadian infantry had not just fought the war, they had redefined the meaning of fear on the battlefield.